I used to love bowling. There was something soothing about the steady rhythm of rolling a heavy ball down the lane, the satisfying crash of pins scattering, the simple repetition of it all. But that was before the night I found myself at that old alley, the one on the edge of town, just past the old factory. I hadn't been there in years, but my regular spot was closed for renovations, and I needed something to clear my head. Strikes and spares. The sign still flickered faintly, even though the place looked abandoned. It was late, and I figured I could sneak in a game or two without anyone bothering me. When I walked in, the first thing that hit me was how empty it was. No people, no sounds, not even the usual hum of machines or music playing. Just silence. It was eerie, but I shrugged it off. Just an old alley, I told myself. The guy behind the counter was slumped over, half asleep, and barely noticed me. He handed me a pair of shoes that looked like they'd seen better days. I slipped them on and headed to the lanes. I picked up a ball, number 13, which was a weird choice for me, but it was the only one that felt right. As I lined up my first shot, something felt off. The ball was heavier than usual, and when I released it, it veered sharply to the left, hitting the gutter with a dull thud. I cursed under my breath, chalking it up to rustiness. But on my second try, the same thing happened. I started to get frustrated. This wasn't how I remembered it. The lanes seemed warped, almost like they were sloping to one side. By the third frame, I was getting annoyed. The ball kept pulling to the left, and I was sure something was wrong with the lane. I went up to the counter to complain, but the guy was gone. I called out, but there was no answer, just the echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. I was the only one there. I walked back to the lane, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping over me. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The pins were all standing slightly off-center, like they hadn't been set up properly. I considered just leaving, but I was stubborn. I was going to finish this game, no matter what. I grabbed the ball again, but as I stepped up to the line, I felt a sharp pain in my foot. I looked down and saw that the sole of one of the shoes had come loose, a rusty nail sticking out from the bottom. I ripped the shoe off and tossed it aside, wincing as I saw a small cut on my foot. Great, just what I needed. I went back to the counter to get a new pair of shoes, but the shelf was empty. The whole place seemed different now, more dilapidated than when I first walked in. The lights flickered, casting long, dark shadows across the lanes. I felt a cold draft even though the doors were closed. The whole place just felt wrong. I was done. I wasn't going to let a bad game ruin my night, so I decided to call it quits. But as I reached the door, I realized I had left my keys back at the lane. I turned to go back, but when I got there, the keys were gone. I searched everywhere, under the benches, around the ball return, but they had just disappeared. My frustration turned to panic. I was stuck there in an empty, decaying bowling alley with no way to get home. I went back to the counter, hoping to find the guy who had given me the shoes, but he was nowhere to be found. I pounded on the door to the back room, but no one answered. The place was deserted. I tried the front door again, but it was locked, and no matter how hard I pushed, it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, hoping someone would come by, but no one did. The place was dead silent, except for the occasional creak or groan from the old building settling. I kept thinking about that nail in the shoe, the warped lanes, the off-center pins. It all felt so wrong. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the faint sound of keys jingling. I ran toward the sound, desperate, and found the guy from the counter just casually walking out of the back room. He looked at me like he hadn't just disappeared for hours. I demanded my keys back, and he just shrugged, reached into his pocket, and handed them to me without a word. I didn't ask any questions. I just took them and got out of there as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced back at the alley, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the doorway, watching me leave. But when I looked again, the door was shut, and the place looked as empty as ever. I don't go bowling anymore. I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that alley, that maybe it wasn't just the building falling apart, but something deeper, something that wanted me to stay. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but I don't plan on going back to find out. I'm not usually one to get rattled, but something about that night at the old bowling alley still sticks with me. It was a typical Friday night, and I needed to blow off some steam after a long week. I remembered this bowling alley on the outskirts of town, the lanes. It's been around forever, but it's not exactly the go-to spot anymore. The place had seen better days, but I figured it'd be quiet, maybe even empty, which was just what I needed. When I pulled into the parking lot, it was nearly deserted. Just a couple of old cars, and I wondered if they even belonged to anyone inside. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a sickly green glow over the entrance. I walked in, and the first thing that hit me was the musty smell, like old shoes and spilled beer that had soaked into the carpet over the years. The place was dimly lit, and there wasn't a soul in sight except for the guy behind the counter who barely looked up as I walked in. I got my shoes, which felt a little too worn out, but I didn't think much of it. I headed to my lane, lane 13, out of habit more than anything else. The ball return was slow, the pins were scuffed, and the whole place just had this air of neglect. But I wasn't there for a perfect game. I just wanted to clear my head. I lined up my first shot, took a deep breath, and rolled. The ball veered to the left, landing in the gutter. I frowned. I wasn't rusty, was I? I tried again, focusing harder, but the ball kept drifting to the left, no matter what I did. Frustration started to build, and I noticed something. Every time the ball rolled back to me, it seemed heavier, like it was dragging something inside. I ignored it, convinced it was just my imagination or the crappy condition of the ball. But then, as I prepared to throw my third ball, the lights in the alley flickered, and for a moment, I was standing in near darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I don't usually get spooked, but standing there in that dim, empty alley, I felt a wave of unease. I brushed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I looked around, trying to spot the guy at the counter, but he wasn't there anymore. The whole place seemed deserted. I decided to finish my game quickly and get out. As I bent down to grab the ball, I noticed a draft of cold air brushing past my legs. That didn't make any sense. The doors were closed, and the heating system was humming somewhere in the background. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone messing with me, but there was no one. I decided to call it quits. But when I walked to the front desk to return the shoes, the guy was nowhere to be found. I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, the sound swallowed by the empty space. I was alone. I left the shoes on the counter, figuring I'd just leave, but when I got to the door, it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, thinking it was stuck, but it felt like someone had locked it from the outside. My pulse quickened as I tried the door again, but it wouldn't move. A surge of panic hit me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I walked back to the counter, hoping there was a back exit, but as I turned the corner, I saw the guy from earlier. He was standing there staring at me with this blank expression. I let out a nervous laugh, explaining that the front door was stuck. He didn't say anything, just walked over, reached behind the counter, and handed me a set of keys. I took them, my hands shaking a little. I thanked him, but he just stared at me, not saying a word. I hurried back to the door, fumbled with the keys, and finally, it opened. I practically ran to my car, throwing the keys into the passenger seat as I slammed the door shut. When I looked back at the alley, the lights were out and the guy was gone. I don't know what it was about that place, but something felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I haven't gone back since, and every time I drive by, I get this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it's nothing, just a run-down bowling alley, but I'm not taking any chances.